Here I want you to just look at that left-hand chart. You see non-Hispanic white. That's 2000, and I want you to notice in every age group, non-Hispanic whites, or what we call in the Southwest Anglos, are expected to be more than 50% of the population. But by 2050, only one age group, 65 plus, with non-Hispanic whites, have over 50% of the population. Well, what does all of this mean for what you are here about today? Let's talk a little bit about this, and I'm going to be lecturing here to the choir, so to speak, or singing to the choir, because many of you know more about this than I do. But this is a standard disaster declaration thing, looking at a very long period of time in the past, and those darker shaded colors tell us various things about various kinds of disasters. This is policies, flood insurance policies, in place in 2011, and you can see people are pretty smart. That is, it tends to be in places that flood that people have flood insurance. And this is the claims, and they're pretty much in the same kind of areas. Well, what is happening, given these demographics, what's happening to these areas that we're talking about? I mean, what kind of people are increasing and so forth? Well, you can see the paid claims. I want to talk about that by talking a little bit about what I'll call coastal states. Now, I realize, and we've looked at this for, by the way, coastal counties, and it comes up with the same general proportions. But these counties, which include, the counties in the Great Lakes area, the states in the Great Lake area, are pretty important. And you know these definitions. I won't give you, spend your time reading something that you know better than I do. This is at least what we can find in the Noah's charts as a definition. First of all, when you look at this particular chart, these are the 10 largest states. They are all coastal states, one way or the other. Okay? And when you begin to look at the diversity in them, is California a diverse state? Absolutely. Is Texas a diverse state? Yes. Is New York a diverse state? Yes. Is Florida a diverse state? Yes. Is Illinois a diverse state? Yes. Pennsylvania a little less, and Ohio a little less, Michigan a little less. Georgia certainly has become a quite diverse state. Similarly, North Carolina. Diverse, yes, in a larger number of factors. So we said, let's take a look and see about the change in these coastal areas. Now, I want you to see, for example, that if you take those coastal states, we had an increase, you see, totally in these states of about 20 million. 13 million of it was due to the Hispanic population, or another way to say it, all of it, because the first number is negative, all of it was due to minority populations. If you look at it in terms of interior states, well, they had about a 2 million increase in their non-Hispanic white population. In other words, the simple fact there is those areas along the coast that are most vulnerable to flooding and other events are increasingly populated by populations with the greatest levels of need and with the fewest socioeconomic resources. I'm going to say that a number of different ways, but that's really the bottom line. And if you look at it in terms of the older population, you'll find fairly similar patterns. I'm going to go to the under 18 population of children. This is the coastal states. Not only did they not have a whole bunch of growth as a result of Anglo population growth overall, what did they do to their future populations, the children? A tremendous decline in the number of non-Hispanic white children. That 3.3 million that we talked about in the country was offset in part by other parts. Otherwise, it would have about states at about 3.9 million. And notice that there was a 3 million increase in the number of Hispanic kids in those states along the coast. And when you look at it for the interior areas, yeah, you see a decline in children as well, but not nearly as large, not nearly as important proportionally. Well, what can all of this mean in addition to putting a lot more people at risk who have a lot fewer resources to use to address those risks? I want to give you an example of what we're talking about, and you're going to have to excuse me, I'm going to use a Texas example. And you've probably been texting to death over the last few days, but we're that way. We kind of like to do that, you know. Although I do have to say that I am not a native Texan. I've only been here 35 years, and that does not make me a native Texan. And you probably think that's not true. But when I first came to Texas, I went to a meeting, and we introduced ourselves, and everybody went around and said, I'm such and such and such. Everybody was from Texas until a guy two ahead of me, and he got up and he said, my name is such and such. I am from such and such Texas, and I'm not a native Texan, but I wasn't born here, but I guess that after 20-some years, that makes me a Texan. The gentleman got up ahead of me, and he said, I want to tell that gentleman who just spoke, if you ain't born here, you ain't never a Texan. So I got up, I said, I'm a Yankee, who just got here, you know, that's it. This is Texas patterns. This is what we see for Texas. Texas saw, what's interesting, a non-Hispanic white growth accounted for 10% of our population growth. That's actually, by the way, a smaller proportion, a larger proportion due to the non-Hispanic white population in Texas than was true in the country as a whole, which was only 8% or so. But you see that 65% of our growth was due to the Hispanic population. Overall, then 89% of our population growth. When we look at our future, if you look at the bottom right-hand chart, we expect the state that will be about 44 million people by about 2040. We expect a state that will be somewhere between a quarter and a third non-Hispanic white, somewhere between 8 and 10% African American, somewhere between about 53 and 59% will be members of other racial and ethnic groups, members of Hispanic populations, and about 6 to 9% will be members of other racial and ethnic groups, primarily Asian. But what does it mean? We did some work, we did some analysis in a work called the Texas Challenge, and did a similar analysis for the country in a work called the America Challenge. And we looked at two questions. What happens if nothing happens? And what happens if something happens? That is, we address some of the changes, and some changes occur in the socioeconomic differences. What this chart shows is we show that for Texas is in the absence of change between the socioeconomic and demographic characteristics, the average Texas household in 2040 would be $6,500 poorer in 2,000 constant dollars than it was in 2000. We also did analysis to show there'd be about a 4% increase in household poverty for family households, as you can see over on the left-hand side. And probably what was most startling to me is we already had about 19% of our labor force that had less than a high school degree, and if we do nothing, we will, by 2040, have 30% of our labor force with less than a high school degree. And most of us here, I think, from Texas would agree that that is not the formula for a high-tech Texas. But my friends, as you begin to look at the numbers for the United States, although I didn't want to bother to bring them today, we also see changes in these directions unless we address some of the differences we'll talk about in a few minutes. One of the answers for this, of course, is education. And why do we say education? Is because this chart always, everywhere, is the same. It shows that education pays. Now, I do have to be a little careful with this chart with school teachers, because you'll notice under bachelor's degree, it says that they make an average of $81,000 a year. Now, some of you may come from states that they make $81,000 a year, but I can tell you they don't in Texas. Okay? And all I can tell them when I talk to school teachers is to say there's obviously been a problem with their withholding. They need to go back to the payroll office and check it out. But obviously these are households, so there can be more than one contributor. But this has been true. In fact, income has been the best single predictor, if you will. I mean, education has been the best single predictor of income since we started measuring this back in the 30s and 40s. And we looked for Texas at one little factor. The blue up here is the levels of attainment in 2000, and the red were some that we projected with a fairly optimistic future. The other is primarily Asian population. So we said, let's do this. Let's assume that those red numbers of attainment continue. Let's assume, however, that the numbers that are better, the proportions in red there, showing for Anglos or non-Hispanic whites, also apply to African Americans and Hispanics. How much difference would it make if we close the gaps? Well, here I want you to look just at the second and the fourth set of slides. And if you compare that 621 to that 938, what you see is the net effect of closing those gaps would be to increase aggregate household income in Texas by over $300 billion per year. Increase in consumer expenditures, looking and comparing the next bars, by over $224 billion per year. Well, I've given you a lot of numbers. George Bernard Shaw actually did say this. A person in my audience one time made me go and find the citation and send it to him. He actually did say this. I didn't make it up. Well, what do I think all of this means? Well, when I look at what all of you are here about, and I look at the costs and dimensions that take place as a result of flood loss, what is very clear from these data is if the demographics are correct at all, those people who will experience those negative consequences will increasingly be from groups that have fewer resources to address those disasters. Your audience will increasingly be minority. In fact, I would argue, if you look at the U.S. as a whole, that the reality is that the future of the United States is tied to its minority populations, and how well they do is how well the United States of America will do. Now you might think, well, why does he say that? I say that because there are actually two populations left in the United States of America. There is an aging, literally off the end of the life chart, set of non-Hispanic whites. Non-Hispanic white fertility has been below replacement now for nearly a quarter of a century. The average non-Hispanic white woman is 41 years of age. So if we're going to have a bunch of births, we need to get at it. And what's going to happen? Immigration? Where would we get immigrants from? Europe? Europe is the oldest, slowest growing part of the world, and the only part of the world that the United Nations projects to have fewer people in it in 2050 than it did in 2000. What does that population need? Well, in a broad sense, it needs help paying for Social Security and Medicare. Then there's a younger population. Let's take a big element of that, the Hispanic population. The reality of it is that group needs help with what? It needs help with education as a way to gain the socioeconomic resources that it will need as it goes forward in time. Our future, as I say, as a member of that first population, and their future are tied and intertwined in ways that will never be unentwined, so to speak. Use a bad set of words. The reality of it is then, is that our fates are in fact interrelated. Now when I look at what you do, it's not only the raw resource issues, but ask yourselves as you prepare your communications, as you prepare your brochures, as you prepare your outreach, what are you going to do to take into account these populations? Certainly no one in the United States, knowing these numbers today, would put out any publications that they wanted to reach the general population that were not in both English and Spanish. But I see government entities all the time that have them only in English. I don't know about your groups. I can say this in total ignorance. What I'm simply saying is many government entities, and I was in the public sector for a long period of time, act like they don't have to worry about marketing. You know, they'll just put out there some generic and the population will come to it. I don't believe that. I believe you've got to reach out to the populations that are growing the most. If you do not do so, I'd argue you're not properly serving the people of America, because the people of America will increasingly be this diverse set of people that we looked at going forward, as you saw from the charts that we talked about. Well, again, all I'm really saying is this. Is the future of our United States is going to be increasingly tied to these minority populations. How well they do is how well we do. And how well we as public servants, be it in the university context or the governmental context or the private sector context, how well we do, I believe in the long run, will depend upon how well we serve them. Thank you.